Today we're experimenting with Varathane Super Glaze. It's a two-part resin epoxy that comes in clear and a variety of tinted colors. We're going to make a black mirror coffee table using a combination of classic gray and aged wood. See if we can turn ordinary MDF into something special, make a really psychedelic looking mirror, and use it as a protective coat over hardwood that's 75 times thicker than a traditional poly clear coat. Now I've seen a lot of river tables, but they tend to use a lot of resin and epoxy, which can get quite expensive. So I wanted to use a mirror to make more of a lake style table that uses the mirror to create that sense of depth and minimizes the amount of epoxy needed. I cut some 3/4 inch oak veneer plywood and loaded it onto my new X-Carve Pro CNC machine. I'm using a pattern that I drew up in Illustrator, and I will make that pattern available for free on the easel software platform. I'll put a link to it in the description box below. I used a 1/8 inch router bit, and in addition to carving out the lines of the pattern, I also carved out a section in the middle so that I could back mount the mirror. I used a Japanese handsaw to cut the tabs and remove the middle piece, gave the top surface a light sanding with 220 grit sandpaper just to get rid of any sort of splintery edges from the CNC processing. I then flipped the board over and traced the outline of the mirror. I'm going to use my palm router to recess this area of the plywood so that the mirror sits in flush to the surface of the plywood. I use clear construction adhesive and silicone to glue the mirror down to the plywood and to seal around the edges. That way I don't get any leaks with the resin epoxy. I also glued an additional layer of plywood strips around the edges just to thicken up the edges of the table and make it a little bit stronger. I'm almost ready to do the epoxy pour, but first I use my Ergo Kiwi knife to just clean up the edges a little bit. Once you pour the epoxy, you don't want to be, getting sticky fingers trying to pick off any little pieces of sawdust or wood splinters. After vacuuming off all of the dust and splinters, I was ready to mix the epoxy. The Varathane Tinted Super Glaze is an all-new way for DIYers to experience pouring epoxy. This innovative pre-tinted resin formula makes it simple to achieve beautiful, consistent results with every project. I am starting with classic gray, and I just want to do the first coat on the bottom of the mirror. I don't really want to go too much thicker than about 1/8 of an inch at a time, so I'm just using about half the contents of this package. I mixed the two parts together and then poured it directly on the mirror. It spreads out on its own quite nicely, and after about 10 to 12 hours, I was ready for a second coat. The third pour of the super glaze came all the way up to the surface of the plywood, and this epoxy is thin enough to spread between these 1/8 inch grooves. I used my Ryobi cordless heat gun to remove bubbles that were coming up to the surface and to help push the epoxy with the force of the air evenly across the grooves. I really like the classic gray color. The deeper you pour it, the more opaque it becomes, and you get this really nice contrast between the surface of the wood, the cut lines, and then the deeper recess that has the mirror behind it. Here you can really see how transparent the super glaze is when it's poured thin, but for this coffee table I want to be a little bit more mysterious, so I added another layer over the top, but this time I used the dark brown color called aged wood. Once the epoxy had fully cured, I took it outside and trimmed the edges and then sanded them down to 220 grit. I then put on some low hairpin legs, since this is going to be a low sitting coffee table that goes with a low sofa, and finished the edges with a plant-based oil wood finish. I used an oil here because I wanted to bring out the dark rich colors on the edges of the plywood, and I'm really happy with the dark and mysterious glossy top and the warm rich tones of the wood on the sides. It's got a really cool look. It sort of feels like something out of a futuristic haunted Victorian mansion. There's a visual depth to the epoxy, and it still works as a mirror, but you can't see any seams on the top of the surface. Now that I know I can control how opaque the epoxy is by the depths of the pour, I decided to CNC a similar pattern into a thick piece of solid ash. I adjusted the file and easel so that the cut lines would progress from about a 1/16 of an inch deep all the way up to almost a 1/4 inch deep. This way there'll be sort of a gradient across the surface of the wood. Now, those lines went all the way to the edges, so I just used some painter's tape backed up with some duct tape so that the epoxy wouldn't run through the edges. This time I'm using the Varathane Super Glaze in Turquoise. And in addition to this piece of ash, I'm also pouring it over the top of a piece of MDF that I also CNC'd. I had some turquoise left over, so I experimented by pouring it along with some clear Super Glaze over the top of this mirror. I just alternated in between them and really like this kind of ethereal set of rings that started to appear on the mirror. I over poured onto the mirror, and then I noticed that a really cool pattern was forming from the drippings. This gave me some ideas about future experiments where I might pour it directly onto a board and then kind of twist and turn it to create really cool patterns on a mirror or a different tabletop. Once the super glaze had fully cured, I used my SawStop table saw to trim the edges of the ash. I sanded it to 220 grit, and this time I'm using Varathane water-based polyurethane in satin. So while I wanted the wood to be rich and colorful with the dark top, I want it to be more light and less saturated in contrast to this turquoise top. And it came out fantastic. The edges are so crisp and sharp, you can really see how thick and durable this super glaze is. They're not kidding when they say it's 75 times thicker than a traditional poly. Check out how the depth of the lines creates that gradient pattern that I was going for. I haven't done a ton of resin or epoxy projects in the past, because you typically have to order them from a specialty retailer and they can be expensive. These kits are affordable, easy to use, and they're going to be available at Home Depot. And tell me, what else can make MDF look this cool? To learn more, check the link in the description below, and congrats to Varathane on launching Super Glaze. It's a really cool new product, and you'll be seeing it in more of our content coming real soon.